Forward TV. The world is thinking.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's panel, Ground Zero Tolerance, Religious Freedom, and America's Culture War, co-sponsored by the New School, more specifically by our division, by the New York Salon and Battle of Ideas, UK. The New School was born in 1919 in a moment of intellectual fearlessness, educational openness, and democratic engagement. The reaction of a group of scholars and intellectuals led by John Dewey, Charles Beard, Herbert Crowley, and others, to the firing of several Columbia University professors for anti-war activism in World War I. I'm proud to be the dean of that founding division, and proud that we're still committed to intellectual fearlessness, democratic engagement, and large-minded debate. Our DNA is evident in the broad array of interdisciplinary, socially engaged programs that we offer in our division: international affairs, media studies, nonprofit management, a bachelor's program for older working people, interdisciplinary programs in urban affairs, environmental studies, and global studies. And our DNA is also evident in the long tradition of public programs that engage the most contentious and consequential issues in spirited, respectful discussion and debate. Programs like tonight's panel. The cultural struggle over the Park 51 Center, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, could not be more important as a crucible of American values and commitments in a diverse democracy. I'm glad that we're co-sponsoring tonight's panel with another organization committed to intellectual fearlessness and robust civic engagement. The New York Salon has been organizing events in New York and Europe for the past 5 years, covering a whole range of issues from ethical fashion to Obama and race. Tonight's forum is part of a month-long Battle of Ideas festival on which the New York Salon has partnered and co-created in Europe, India, and here in the US. Let me kick things off by turning the panel over to tonight's moderator, Alan Miller, co-director of the New York Salon. Alan is a director, author, producer, co-founder of the Truman Brewery, a 10-acre complex of recording studios, art galleries, entertainment spaces, restaurants, and other businesses anchoring a new cultural quarter in London's East End. He's directed music videos. He writes on cultural politics for the Huffington Post, Spiked, and other publications. In other words, he could teach in just about every single program that our division offers. Alan will introduce the panelists and moderate the discussion. Join me in welcoming them all.
Well, good evening, and thank you, David. I'm Alan Miller, and we're very pleased to welcome you tonight to the New York Salon, which, as David told us, is a part of a series of 2 in New York, actually, tied in with the Battle of Ideas Festival. The next one, which is on immigration, on the 17th of November. The news that the clearance was given for building an Islamic cultural centre that was often referred to in the media by many as the Ground Zero Mosque resulted in a huge national debate that went worldwide about whether or not it was acceptable to build this so close to Ground Zero. We also saw the pastor Terry Jones receive international attention and get a call from the Defence Secretary, Robert Gates, based on his announcement that he would burn the Quran on the anniversary of 9/11 if the site was to go ahead. General Petraeus weighed in as well on this, saying that for Jones to do so would threaten American lives in Afghanistan. So in a city that's so often considered to be so liberal, it's interesting that over 2/3 of New Yorkers that were polled in September by the New York Times supported relocating the Corboda Institute, which changed its name to the Park 51 Cultural Centre as a response to a hostile reaction from bloggers such as Pamela Geller and later Sarah Palin to a less controversial spot, even though they recognised their right to build there. The developer, Sharif El-Gamal, argued that his intention was to create a place of multi-faith dialogue and cited the Jewish Community Centre on the Upper West Side and 92nd Street Y as similar examples of this aspiration. We've seen some provocative political videos as well from Rick Lazio referring to the issues around Imam Faisal's comments in the past and Imam Rauf's relationships, and yet those that defended the centre seem to do it often on the basis that it would be a bridge to cultural harmony and promote moderation and diversity. Some have criticised this as being insufficient defence of freedom, and others have pointed to similarities in debates that have raged across Europe currently around whether to ban the burqa, hijabs, and even minarets. Well, tonight our panellists shall reflect on these issues and many more, and we're looking forward to having you, the audience, involved in this. We're very lucky to have such an esteemed panel tonight to discuss this issue, and I'm only going to give you their reduced bios, but if you do want to find out a little bit more about them, just look on our site, www.nysalon.org. They're very impressive, each and every one of them. Directly next to me is Wendy Kaminer, who's a lawyer and a social critic. She's a correspondent for The Atlantic and theatlantic.com, and her book is The Worst Instincts, Cowardice, Conformity, and the ACLU. Next to Wendy is, we've all changed in order now, but next to Wendy is Kristen Saloomey, who's a correspondent for the broadcaster Al Jazeera. And then we have Zead Ramadan, who is chairman of the New York Council on American Islamic Relations. And on the end is Brendan O'Neill, who's an editor of a UK online publication called Spiked, a feature writer for the Christian Science Monitor in America and for the BBC in Britain. I'd like to invite you all to give our panellists a quick round of applause to welcome them here. Now, just before I introduce them to ask them to speak, we are all going to get a chance to speak. And at the New York Salon, we've got a very firm belief that everyone's adults and robust and they can engage in grown-up conversation in a civil way, which means that everybody gets a chance to say exactly what they want, but they will be expected to defend themselves and argue their points without having a fit and freaking out and screaming, because that's what adults do in a civil environment. So, we are going to start this evening with Wendy.
Thank you. Well, like most things, the Park 51 controversy is overdetermined, but by which I mean that it has many causes and there are many ways of analyzing it. I want to focus on the way in which liberalism has laid the groundwork for the pretty successful opposition to this community center. I think that the controversy over this center reflects what's become a rather familiar crisis in contemporary liberalism, or what passes for liberalism today, involving its virtual embrace of censorship, its therapeutic approach to rights, its very expansive definitions of harm, and its hostility to freedom of speech, conscience, and belief. The arguments that opponents of the mosque have been advancing fairly successfully about its potential to inflict emotional harm on 9/11 survivors are the arguments that have been honed and popularized by progressives, feminists, critical race theorists, and advocates of equality and diversity who believe that the First Amendment rights must be sacrificed in order to have a tolerant, equal, diverse society. So no one should have been surprised when the ADL came out in opposition to this community center, partly because the ADL very similarly came out in opposition to a planned march by neo-Nazis through a community of Holocaust survivors about, 30 or 40 years ago. But also because for years now, decades really, liberals have been elevating sensitivity over liberty. For how long have we heard right-thinking liberals say, I don't believe in censorship, but free speech doesn't include a right to hate speech. I don't believe in censorship, but free speech doesn't include the right to offend, which leaves me wondering what it might include and why we need the Constitution to protect a right not to offend. Now, this is probably most evident, I'll just say very quickly, on college campuses, where students risk being punished and are regularly punished for jokes, satire, insults, and also political speech that's considered demeaning to some presumptively vulnerable group. The illiberalism of contemporary liberalism is also reflected in a lot of support for legislation that prohibits hate speech or other speech that's considered to inflict some sort of emotional harm. This is an approach that I think both reflects and promotes an anti-libertarian, result-oriented approach to the First Amendment. And I think this much was made clear in the controversies that Alan mentioned, these dual controversies about the threat to burn a Koran, which coincided with this controversy over the proposal to build Park 51. Some people think that burning a Koran ought to be prohibited because it is so profoundly offensive, and others think that the building of this community center should be prohibited because it's profoundly offensive for Muslims to worship or even gather so close to Ground Zero. Now, I think it's worth stressing that both sides invoked similar arguments, the kind of arguments that are used to support hate speech legislation about avoiding the infliction of emotional harm. So, of course, Sarah Palin echoed the ADL when she said, you have a right to burn a Koran, but it's unnecessarily provocative and very insensitive, just like building a mosque near Ground Zero. Now, I'm not comparing building a community center with burning a Koran. Burning a Koran is more like burning an American flag, but I'm also not going to hold my breath waiting for Sarah Palin to stand up for the right to burn an American flag. The point is that there are the same or very similar rights and freedoms implicated in both of these controversies and the same arguments used against them. Now, of course, Palin and the ADL and everyone else in these controversies have the right to denounce the insensitivity of burning a Koran or building a community center. No one is denying that. But it is, what I'm objecting to is this consistent elevation of sensitivity over liberty. And it is sophistry, or maybe it is simply delusional, to insist that you can protest the building of this community center because it's so insensitive and claim that that's entirely consistent with support for the right to build it. Because sensitivity policing by private groups is protected by the First Amendment. Of course it is. But it's important to remember the way in which it undermines the foundational commitment to freedom of speech and belief. It leads, at best, to what John Stuart Mill so famously called the despotism of custom, but it can also very easily lead to the despotism of law. So our time is brief here, and before Alan passes me a note, which I think he may be about to do, let me just stress that while there are a lot of people a lot of liberals and progressives are the people who are supporting the right to build this community center, but in my view, a lot of them are also partly to blame for the opposition to it, because the sense that we have a right not to be emotionally harmed, the sense that there are illicit emotions, that hatred is an illicit emotion, and that it ought to be somehow controlled by the state. This is a creation of contemporary liberalism. So people who support the right to build this mosque out of regard for tolerance and diversity should not be surprised or offended when their own intolerance for liberty is turned against them. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. Zead.
Thank you, Alan. I'm honored to be on New York Salon, and I'm really humbled to be with this very distinguished panel. I'm going to talk about my perspective on the discussion regarding Park 51. And I actually wrote something down. I wish I was as talented as Wendy. This summer, nearly 9 years after the murderous attack on our nation by villains, in what we now infamously know as 9/11, I picked up the daily papers and read words that sent me off into daydreams about primary school history classes. I remembered my junior high school teacher, Mr. Griffin, slamming his fist on the desk, sending a bolt of adrenaline in all of us who had fallen asleep, saying it was nationalism that started the war to end all wars, World War I. All of those countries believed they were better, stronger, and would be quickly victorious and happily went off to war against their neighbors. And years later, they could only pray that all of the bloodshed would end soon. I remembered my high school and favorite teacher, Mr. Kissinger, history again, say, can anyone name any group in U.S. history whose basic First Amendment constitutional rights were violated? And I remembered him responding to the students, that's right. Good. That's also correct. That's right, too. When he got to me, all the answers I had were already used up by my fellow classmates. So I changed my question quickly and said, Mr. Kissinger, why did our government allow all of these groups to be persecuted if we had laws? He didn't have an answer. But Mr. Kissinger, a son of European Jews, rattled off some famous sayings that I believe were born from his tradition, such as, and we all know these sayings, when they came for my neighbor, I said nothing, and when they came for me, there was no one left to defend me. And he reminded us of basic human requisite attributed to great Rabbi Hillel, treat your neighbors as you'd like to be treated. And a big fan of Martin Luther King, he also quoted him saying, the ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over those good people. He didn't know how to answer the question why our government didn't do enough to protect, whether it was Jews, whether it was people of African descent, Quakers, Catholics. But he wanted to give us a lesson, in the way he only knew how. The recent controversy over Park 51 was sort of a phenomena, but not unique. Yet the timing created a perfect storm, if you will. 9 years after 9/11, we have the ability to make data instantly viral on the lawless internet. We have blogs where your deepest fears and prejudices can be made public yet anonymous. We had the pivotal midterm elections. We have a black president whose historic popularity has plummeted while accused of being a Muslim. We had a leading Republican New York gubernatorial candidate stake his run on demonizing Muslims in Park 51. The economy is in a coma. The ADL's national director, Abe Foxman, who chose to stand against those whose constitutional rights were threatened. Palin was back on the scene. Newt Gingrich is back from the dead. The Tea Party is dressed as colonists marching against seemingly everything. And of course, we have Fox News. As the Muslim population had grown to a robust 1.5% of our nation over the decades, they've built houses of worship to serve their communities, to pray to the Abrahamic God. Reasons for building mosques are no different than those for building churches and temples, to serve a community. The building rate didn't seem to have increased, but the rhetoric against building mosques and Muslims has exponentially increased in just these few months. How does this relate to Europe? Someone asked. I believe Islamophobia in Europe and in the U.S. are related, but may have different main concerns. Both claim their raison d'etre is to oppose Islamic extremism. They really don't mention much else about any other kind of extremism. But some members openly state they are Muslim haters. With the Stop the Islamization of Europe motto, racism is the lowest form of human stupidity, but Islamophobia is the height of common sense. And the copycat U.S. organization Stop the Islamization of America had a founding board member say something to the extent of, you should kill all Muslims, even women and children, as they may have the bullet that gets you in the back. Though they fan the flames of hatred towards Muslims, I believe in Europe, it is more due to the fact that Muslims are a large minority. They're affecting their economy and demanding rights in countries where they are not native. And in the U.S., our issue is primarily concerned over fear by fellow Americans on terrorism. But our fellow Americans are also not native. What is certainly in common is the fact that there's a large proportion of Europeans and Americans who don't know enough about Islam and Muslims. And this is the fuel that has made it easy to ignite a furor and prior to educating themselves fairly. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Zead. And Kristen, please, thanks.
Thank you very much. I think no matter how you feel about having a place where Muslims pray a few blocks away from Ground Zero, it's undeniable right now that Muslim Americans are having a very hard time in this country. And as a reporter, this is something that I've seen and reported on and witnessed. And these are Muslim Americans, American citizens. Some are recent immigrants who are struggling to assimilate, and others are families who've been here for generations. They feel that their basic rights are being threatened right now, and there is evidence to support them. Hate crimes appear to be up. Remember the Bangladeshi taxi driver who was slashed, the mosque in Tennessee that was set on fire. FBI informants routinely go into Islamic places of worship, and I will give them the benefit of the doubt that they're doing this for good reason. They want to prevent a terrorist attack, but imagine if you're a Muslim, how this makes you feel. A little uncomfortable knowing that you're being watched, or your conversations with the wrong person may come back to haunt you. Muslims who are arrested are often denied rights that are standard for other people in prison, like praying together. And they're denied privileges, like hugging a 10-year-old child, a family member who comes to visit them. One Muslim American college student who was arrested while studying in London spent a lengthy sentence in solitary confinement, almost 3 years, before he was even convicted of anything. People who oppose the Islamic Community Center do not deny that Muslims have a right to build there. They say they have the right, but it isn't right. It's insensitive. And yet, since the controversy erupted, other mosques are being challenged in New York and elsewhere. So it would appear that their freedom to practice their religion is certainly being threatened. Muslims who speak out and take part in public life can expect to have every comment that they've ever said about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict scrutinized and criticized, and any attempt at nuance in their political discussion often comes back to haunt them, and they're labeled a terrorist sympathizer. If you think of Debbie Almontaser, the woman who is supposed to be the principal of the first Arabic school here in New York City, not unlike what's happened to the imam behind the Park 51 project. So I would say that Muslim Americans have a right to feel that their free speech is being threatened as well. The funny thing about the Park 51 project, when you talk to people who live in Lower Manhattan, as I have doing stories down there, they are overwhelmingly in favor of having it there. I know there are polls in New Yorkers overall. There's some concern. There's Alan, I think you had a figure there, but 70%, two-thirds against. But randomly, I ran into people on the street when I was covering the rallies who lived in the neighborhood and knew Imam Faisal because he'd been in the community for since before 9/11, and after 9/11, he has been praying even at the site now where they want to build the community center for some time. They know him, and they're comfortable with him. They consider him a neighbor, and since September 11th, a lot of people have moved into that area. There's not a lot of recreation space, so a lot of them were looking forward to having a place where they could go and swim or see events and things of that nature. The rallies that I covered down there were very much attended by people from outside of the area. The community board overwhelmingly supported the project. The borough president supports it. The mayor supports it. When it comes to the 9/11 family members, it's true that there's a lot of concern and distrust of the imam, but there's also 9/11 family members who support the project and the imam as well. I think when you watch the story on television, you get very ramped up rhetoric, and you kind of get the extreme ends of the debate on both sides. And because of the nature of media, we tend to grab the best 15-second soundbite and the most salacious comments, and it can seem very angry and militant on both sides. But when you actually talk to people, when you talk to the family members, they don't seem that far apart. It seems like if they could come together and they could talk, that maybe, you know, it wouldn't be so bad and people wouldn't be so angry or so polarized. Which raises the question of the role of media and the role of the blogosphere in this debate. Surveys do show that negative feelings towards Muslims have increased in this country since September 11th. Why now? Why are there more negative feelings? Is it just that people are more comfortable expressing them? Has this debate emboldened people to give voice to those concerns? I don't have the answer. I'm hoping maybe you guys can help enlighten me tonight. At Al Jazeera, we certainly struggled with how best to cover stories like the pastor and the Quran burning. Here's a man who has a following of less than 50 people. Does he deserve to lead the news every night and get that kind of coverage, or does that just take things out of perspective by doing that? I don't have the answer. But the point that I'm trying to make is that I think Muslim Americans, this forum is supposed to be about religious tolerance, and I think that Muslim Americans do have reason to feel that their rights are being threatened in this country.
Thank you, thank you. And now Brendan.
Thanks, Alan. Looking at this debate from afar, from over in Britain, it seems to me that neither side has very much to recommend it, really. In fact, both sides have indulged in the politics of fear, and both sides have cynically used the controversy over the Ground Zero Mosque to try to magic up a new political narrative. A narrative in which they themselves feature as political heroes, and anyone else who opposes them is depicted as stupid, ignorant, and possibly even fascistic. So one side in the debate, the people who oppose the mosque, tell us that the greatest threat to mankind is Islamofascism. And they present themselves as doing everything in their power to stop this Islamofascism from digging its claws into Western society. The other side in the debate, the mostly liberal thinkers who have defended the right to build the mosque, claim that the real threat today is Islamophobia. As that excitable Time magazine front cover asked, is America Islamophobic? And these defenders of the mosque present themselves as heroically taking a stand against the hatred of Muslims and in defense of the American values of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. But I'm afraid to say that I don't believe either side. I'm not convinced by either side. I don't believe that Islamofascism is a serious force that threatens to topple America, and I don't believe that Islamophobia is sweeping this country either. I think that both Islamofascism and Islamophobia are largely invented, or certainly vastly exaggerated problems, which many right-wing Americans and many liberal Americans are hiding behind in order to express their own fears and prejudices that they don't want to express openly and honestly. So to take the first side in the debate, the protesters against the so-called mosque, I mean, their fear-fueled exaggerations have been well documented now. You know, most of us now know that the Ground Zero Mosque will not be at Ground Zero and will not be a mosque. You know, in reality, the Park 51 Centre will be on the site of the old Burlington coat factory. As we've heard, it will have a swimming pool, a gym, a restaurant, meeting rooms, and a prayer space. This is not going to be Mecca by any stretch of the imagination. But because Burlington Coat Factory meeting space doesn't sound very scary or even particularly interesting, those who oppose the Park 51 Centre have opted to call it the Ground Zero Mosque instead, a label that immediately conjures up the idea that cocky Islamists are building a mosque on the site of their greatest assault in the clash of civilizations. And it seems pretty obvious to me why the key public protesters against Park 51 are doing this. It's because some on the American right like nothing better than to have a mortal enemy to rail against. You know, since the demise of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, lots of American right-wingers have pretty much been holding open auditions to find a kind of Soviet replacement, to find a kind of political methadone for the heroine that was the evil Eastern Empire for so long. And they've been looking for a person or a thing or a phenomenon against which they might define themselves and their worldview. And their current favourite is Islamofascism, Al-Qaeda, radical Islam, which they present as a coherent army of anti-Americans, when in truth it is a ragbag collection of tiny groups and self-deluded individuals which don't pose a great threat to Western civilization. So Newt Gingrich, who's one of the most vocal opponents of the Ground Zero Mosque, describes America as being at risk from stealth jihadism. And he compares the struggle against this stealth jihadism to America's historic standoff with communism. And here I think we can really see the two things driving the opponents of the Ground Zero Mosque. First, they are utterly incapable of getting to grips with the real problems facing America today, with what is really bringing about a crisis in American values. So they just blame everything on external actors, on imaginary stealth jihadists. And second, they quite clearly are on the lookout for a communist-style enemy against which they might reassert what they consider to be American values. But the other side in the debate about the Ground Zero Mosque is also based in fear and mythology. As soon as some Americans expressed concern about Park 51, the great and the good in the liberal commentariat started fretting about Islamophobia. And you almost get the impression that they were waiting for something like this to happen, so that they could say, finally could say, see, we told you that ordinary Americans are stupid and prejudiced. So a fairly small-scale protest against Park 51 and a few opinion polls gave rise to a tsunami of commentary about Islamophobia. From the front page of Time magazine to the column pages of the Washington Post, we were told that America was being consumed by a hatred of Islam. And when these people talked about America, they didn't mean themselves. They didn't mean people who work at Time magazine or people who read Time magazine. They meant those other Americans, the ones who watch Fox News, the ones who like Sarah Palin, the ones who are apparently more given to prejudice than clever East Coast journalists. But the reality is that Islamophobia is a figment of the liberal imagination, as much as stealth jihadism is a figment of Newt Gingrich's imagination. By any measurement, Americans have remained remarkably tolerant in the 9 years since 9/11. It is true, as we're reminded again and again, that in 2001, the year of the attacks, there were 554 recorded anti-Islamic hate crimes in America. But in 2002, that number fell to 170, and it has remained around that level since. And in a country of 300 million people and around 6 million Muslims, that is really low. There is no widespread phobia. There is no widespread irrational hatred of Muslims. And I think what this fear of Islamophobia really expresses is the complete and utter disconnect between the liberal elite and ordinary Americans. You know, lacking any meaningful connection with everyday Americans, the liberal elite simply assumes that they are a mob in waiting, a mob consumed by Fox-fueled prejudices. You know, they even refer to the protesters against Park 51 as un-American, which, to my British mind, immediately makes me think of Joseph McCarthy's demonization of communists as an internal threat to the American way of life, as being un-American. So where sections of the American right present themselves as defending American values against an external army of Islamists, sections of the American liberal world present themselves as defending American values against prejudiced people here in America. You know, one defender of the mosque says he is part of a struggle for the soul of the United States. In other words, he is fighting to defend America's soul from America's prejudiced people. He is fighting to defend American liberty against the stupid American masses. That is the very definition of elitism. And I think in presenting ordinary people as potentially Islamophobic, some of the defenders of the Ground Zero Mosque really echo one of the most interesting and least commented on aspects of our post-9/11 world, which is the elite's fear of the unpredictable masses here in the West. So if you think back, after 9/11 in America, after 7/7 in Britain, after the train bombings in Madrid, one of the various governments' first instincts was to insist that no one should attack Muslims. They posted policemen outside mosques. In Britain, we even passed new legislation outlawing hate speech against Islam. And I think this has been possibly the most striking thing about our government's response to terrorism. They are so completely disconnected from the public, so fearful of us, that even when there is a violent attack carried out by outsiders, their first thought is, how will our own people respond? Let's clamp down on them, let's curb their speech, let's control where they go and what they say. So I think we need to cut through the debate about the Ground Zero Mosque and ask what is really motivating the two camps in this discussion. We need to tease out the politics and the prejudices that drive those who fear Islamofascism and those who fear Islamophobia, and have a more upfront, honest discussion about the meaning and the future of Western society.
Thank you. Brendan. Right, well, before I go out to you guys, I wanted to come back on a couple of things that have come up that seem quite striking, and just with the panel here. Just firstly, on this issue of sensitivity, I mean, a lot of people have mentioned it, and it was striking in the New York Times article about the poll that they did, and Kristen's right, that there are different views across the whole of the borough of Manhattan and the 5 areas and within Manhattan. But it was noticed, what kept coming up was the discussion of sensitivity, and I'm interested to hear what the panel thinks, because one of the quotes of someone in New York made the point that her granddaughter had had a conversation with her and said that stopping the building is going against the freedom of religion guaranteed under the Constitution. And she said that she really agreed with her granddaughter, but in this world not everything's black or white, and there's always a grey area. And the grey area is the sensitivity around those affected by 9/11. Now, Wendy talked a lot about how this has been a recurring theme in different areas that groups have alluded to. And I'm wondering what the other panellists think about that. I know, Kristen, you made the point about sensitivity coming up, so I'm interested to hear initially your thoughts and your response to some of the things that Wendy was saying about sensitivity.
About whether or not...
whether it should be an exception, that in certain situations that the universal rights that are granted should be perhaps not pursued.
Should be limited by sensitivity concerns.
That's a slippery slope, I think. I mean, how can you define that? How can you make... No, I mean, I think the Constitution was set up for instances like this specifically, not for the easy times and the good times, but the Constitution was supposed to be the bedrock in hard times when people disagree, and national security, of course, is the ultimate challenge to those freedoms and beliefs. You know, the government has a legitimate interest in trying to protect us and prevent another 9/11 from happening, but where do you draw the line once you start crossing those freedoms?
So thoughts on hate speech then, and what that means in this context? Zead?
Sure. Well, just to touch on that sensitivity issue real quickly, I think that a lot of the discussion was about the sensitivity of the families who lost loved ones at 9/11, but there was never a recognition, there was never a sort of a generally accepted recognition that many Muslims also perished in those buildings, that they belong to the group of families that lost loved ones. There was even a worship space in World Trade Center too, and several hundred Muslims used to go up there and pray. And that was never acknowledged. And it was interesting, the cover of the New York Times had a picture of members of the family who lost loved ones, and right there smack in the center of the photo, and they showed people walking around this space that was going to be exclusively for family members, was a man in traditional Muslim garb. He was Pakistani, and it said his name, Mustafa Ahmed, or something very common, commonly Islamic name. And he was right there. And that hit home for me when I saw a picture of a Muslim man who was throwing a rose into a pool of water that was supposed to represent the passing of their loved ones. So that was something that I thought was striking and that no one really wanted to accept. And they just said Muslims did this, and they had, kind of plastered the impression that all Muslims should bear the collective guilt for this act. It didn't matter if you were Muslim and you lost loved ones. It didn't matter if you were Muslim and you were there as a first responder. It didn't matter if you were a first responder, went up into the buildings and died, as had happened as well. there was just a sensitivity on one side of the equation, not on the other. And no matter how loud Muslims screamed, they do not represent me. They do not represent my religion. They hijacked our religion as well. And they've ruined all of our lives around the world who represent this religion fairly and nicely. And no one ever said, and people rarely just considered, how do we treat similar cases? A man flew his plane into the IRS building in Austin, Texas. No one ever said he's a terrorist. They just said he's an angry white man. When Eric Rudolph would blow up, in the name of religion, Eric Rudolph would blow up abortion clinics. No one ever said, oh, it's Christianity at work. No, so it was easy for people to separate Christians from terrorist acts, but whenever a Muslim does it, and that's a sensitivity that I think that we have to also consider, or else collective guilt, we can just stamp that on every other group in this country, and it would be difficult.
But are you saying that, because Wendy made a point that we've had the elevation of sensitivity over liberty, are you saying that there should be some instances in which the consideration of sensitivity should be recognised and be paramount?
In my opinion, and given our history here in the United States, from the persecution of Quakers and not allowing them to have a church by Governor Stuyvesant, same thing with the Jews. Governor Stuyvesant did not allow them to build a temple in New York City. I don't agree. I think that the Constitution should be paramount. I think it's the foundation. I think our founding fathers, never in my life have I had an appreciation for the intellect of our founding fathers like I did in the past half year. I said, oh my God, when I look back at history and all the different situations, I said, these guys put together a framework that answered practically all issues. They looked back at the War of the Roses wasn't that far behind them, maybe just 100 years. They had looked back at all the strife in Europe. They had looked back and said, oh my God, all of this might have had something to do with religion. We need to be able to invite anybody, no matter what they wear, whether they have dreadlocks, whether they have wooden shoes, whether they have, no matter what they have to come here, put their religion aside and make it a private issue, and you must live under these laws. And if you can do that, that's what's enabled us to be the longest-standing successful democracy in the history of the world. Once we lose that, then we're opening up these can of worms to, oh, I'm too sensitive, and let's persecute.
Okay, thanks. Brendan?
I think there's way too much sensitivity these days. People are too sensitive about everything. And in fact, the debate about the mosque is a competition of sensitive feelings. It is a competition of victimhoods. On the one side, you have right-wing shock jocks and politicians exploiting the kind of feelings of sensitivity amongst 9/11 families to say we shouldn't do this, it's not allowed, as Wendy described very well. But then on the other side, you have Muslim groups and Muslim spokespeople saying, oh, your protests are really offending us, it's terrible, we've got no rights, we're being treated like the Jews were in the past, which I think is an exaggeration, by the way. And so you have this kind of competition of different victim outlooks, and it's just not a very useful starting point for a discussion. There's no substance to the discussion. There's no discussion about what freedom means and why freedom's important. And in fact, if you look back, if you look at bin Laden's statements over the past 10 years, I have read them all, unfortunately, actually he is also motivated by the politics of victimhood, and he talks very much about everyone ignores Muslim suffering, America doesn't care about Muslims, no one listens to us, no one pays any attention to us, and he even justifies 9/11 on those grounds. 9/11 was the Muslims saying you have to pay attention to us, our suffering counts just as much as yours. So there is an argument to be made that even 9/11 itself was an act of therapeutic terrorism, an expression of extreme violent sensitivity. So I just think we need to be careful about where this kind of politics of victimhood gets us, because it is quite irrational. Self-pity is a really dangerous emotion, so you should just kind of get over it. Now, I really support freedom of religion, but I think there's an important point. In terms of the people who are defending the right to build the mosque, there's a real problem here, because they have kind of twisted the meaning of tolerance. So I'm completely in favour of tolerance. I think it's a key Enlightenment ideal. We should tolerate the existence and people's right to practice their religious faith. But then the people defending the mosque are telling us that it will be wonderful. It will do all these wonderful, magical things. It will bring together the faiths. It's beautiful, and we should respect it. Now, tolerance and respect are not the same things, and I think a lot of the reaction against the mosque, the so-called mosque, is that people have been told they must respect it, and they don't want to respect it. Why should they respect it? They don't have to. Tolerance does not mean suspending judgment. Tolerance does not mean suspending your critical faculties and accepting everything as equally valid. You can tolerate someone's religious faith while at the same time criticizing it and not liking it. We need to remember that in the discussion about the Ground Zero Mosque. I say go ahead and build it, let's tolerate it, but if people want to protest and criticize it and say it's a pile of rubbish, they have that freedom.
I feel a little badly for Alan because I think he tried to get us to disagree with each other, and he seems to have failed, but I'm hopeful that there'll be many people in the audience who disagree. I don't want to repeat what I said initially. I just want to add, since I'm so often accused of being such a hard-hearted bitch when I say things about the problem with a therapeutic approach to rights, sensitivity is a paramount value in private life. But you really, to a great extent, you need to put your personal sensitivities aside when you enter the public arena, and you need to armor yourself. You know, I'm fond of reminding my husband that he has no First Amendment rights in relation to me. but that's in the private sphere. And I think we need to remember that, you know, and I think part of what's happened is that we're beginning to treat the public sphere or have the same kind of expectations about our relationships in the public sphere that we might feel perfectly justified in having in private relationships and in the private sphere. And to those of you who I think will disagree and will talk about the need to impose some kind of sensitivity-based limitation on the exercise of free speech rights, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, maybe you all think that's a bad idea. But to those of you who may not, you know, I would simply say that the state cannot protect us from emotional harm and cannot cater to our emotional sensitivities without violating somebody's freedom of conscience, speech, and belief. And so you really do have to choose. It's a pretty stark choice. Do you either want your full freedom of speech, conscience, and belief, or do you want the people in power looking out for your sensitivities, understanding that the people whose sensitivities are going to be protected is going to vary according to whoever is in power protecting them? Thanks.
Thanks. Well, and I want you to start thinking about coming. I'm going to do one more round of the panel, and then I'm going to come out to the audience. But Zead mentioned in his quote about racism being the lowest form of stupidity, but then Islamophobia is the height of common sense. I mean, I'm interested to hear what people are saying, particularly about Brendan's point, that in a way, this is really about the elite sphere, the stupid masses, that in fact, Islamophobia is as much a figment of the imagination as Islamofascism. And to what extent people think that you know, the discussion has been about stupid, ignorant, dumb people, or you know, in the way it's been presented. So Zead, firstly, on that.
Thanks, Alan. It's not necessarily stupid, ignorant, dumb people. It's just people who've never run into Muslims or never learned about Islam. I would guesstimate that 2/3 of the American public, 300+ million people here, 200 million people have probably never met a Muslim or don't know that they did. So when I walked into the diner in a little town as I'm driving through to Michigan to visit my in-laws, and I said, hold the bacon, please, on that breakfast special. And I was just sitting there with my New York Mets cap. They had no idea I was a Muslim. But that was a signal. They didn't know. And I greeted them courteously and kindly. And if you were to say to them, what do you think about Muslims? Well, they'll say, what a nice chap. After I left, and they'd say, he was quite a gentleman. Wow, he left a nice tip. New Yorkers. And but after the conversation, you'd hear in the booth behind you is darn them, they're trying to take over our country, and they just don't know. They haven't run into Muslims, and what they read, unfortunately, is what they know about Muslims, and it has nothing to do. I've even met Muslims who believe misinformation about Muslims. I'm not exaggerating. This was a PhD at an Ivy League institution that said, I went to Amman, Jordan, and you Arabs are really nice. You are very generous, and you're very courteous, and you're very polite. It's really weird. It's very unlike what I've read. And so it's not just the people who don't know. I mean, if that's what your world is, you're into science, and you pick up the New York Post or you pick up the New York Times and you read what they're writing, and they're gauging the conversation to go one way, that's what you're going to believe. And unfortunately, most of our country, I mean, no one's making an effort to. I'll take the elective in Middle Eastern Studies. I'll take the elective in Islamic history to find out about all of the treasures that Islam had given to the world, whether it's astronomy or botany or medicine or, no one knows that. And they don't know that you must believe in Jesus to be a Muslim. And if they did know those things, I think that they would think differently about him and become a little bit more compassionate to their neighbor. And some people have neighbors they're wonderful with, and they all of a sudden tomorrow they turn the page just because they discover they're Muslim. It's really strange.
But Zead, I mean, you mentioned when you Kristen, you mentioned when you were doing your research and reporting downtown that a lot of people seemed comfortable with the situation. I'm wondering though, so what do you think about the way that the media, and you talked a lot about the media, there has been a discussion on one side that seems to represent people who are opposed to it going there. The term bigot has come up a lot. And I'm wondering what you think about that and the use in this context.
Well, I mean, I don't think you can dismiss the existence of Islamophobia, at least the feeling among Muslims that they're being persecuted right now. And I think that is something that is out there, although this does remain an incredibly free and tolerant country by most standards. But I wouldn't, I wouldn't dismiss the feelings of 9/11 families either. I think it's a natural, people who've suffered such incredible violent losses obviously are going to have some kind of gut reactions and look to assign blame. I think it's natural. Recently, retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens came out and talked about his reaction to Japanese people going to visit the Pearl Harbor Memorial and how he felt in his gut like that was the wrong thing. It wasn't right. But in his brain, he kind of later rationalized that you can't collectively blame a people for something that they're not responsible for, that their government is responsible for, or some people in their group are responsible for.
But so what do you think? Sorry, what do you think about this point that perhaps across America, and we've sort of heard it before in elections as well. It's not just around this, that some of those people, they just don't get it. They just don't know. They're a little bit ignorant. I mean, is it the case that because people feel like they're being persecuted, they actually are? Or is that an elevation of feelings as well? I suppose that's my first question. And more broadly about the idea that those people just don't get it.
Well, I mean, I think, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there is evidence that that Muslims in legal settings are facing threats to their rights. I mean, in the way they are arrested, the way they are held, the way they are questioned. So there is some evidence to back up that they are victims here.
If I can just interject for a minute, because I did want to respond to Brendan's discussion of this, and I always enjoy Brendan's analysis, but I think in this case your juxtaposition of Islamophobia with Islamofascism is in some ways a little too neat, to the extent that I think you really are underestimating the kind of prejudice and persecution that's being visited upon a lot of Muslim Americans. And it's not necessarily coming from other Americans. A lot of it is coming from the government. You said that you thought it was interesting that one of the first things the government did was after 9/11, was to assume that Muslims would be under attack from other Americans, and so they posited guards at mosques and did things like that. But in fact, immediately after 9/11, the government swept up, I can't remember now how many people it was, but it was in the thousands, swept up thousands of people on pretexts, on minor immigration violations, summarily detained them, under really bad conditions for months and months. and a lot of it, so it's not, we can't really measure this by the number of hate crimes, because that's not really the primary problem. I'm not suggesting that hate crimes aren't a problem, but the primary problem is a serious repressive efforts by the U.S. government, whether it's racial profiling, whether it's the people who are summarily detained, imprisoned without any due process, whether it's the crackdown on Muslim charities. I mean, this is still a relatively free country, as free countries go. But I think you and I don't think you mean to be dismissive of it at all. I think you're making a different point. But I think you can't ignore that Muslim Americans really are under attack, have been under attack in a lot of ways for the last decade, and a lot of those attacks are coming from the government.
Brendan, and then if people want to speak, can you start making a line either side of the microphones here, because that's how we're going to do it. So you can come on down. Brendan.
Well, I'll come back to that, but I just want to, on the question about racism and is racism just a problem of people's ignorance, I mean, there's been a really interesting redefinition of racism in the past 30 or 40 years. It's been redefined from what people recognize to be an elite ideology, an expression of a kind of elite form of prejudice and an ideological outlook, to now being seen as just an irrational phobia amongst ignorant people. As you well described, people who don't know Muslims, people who don't have never met Muslims. The idea now is that racism springs from ordinary people's ignorance. That redefinition is very interesting. And you can really see it in the shift from the use of the term ism to phobia. We used to have racism, the recognition that this was an ideological outlook. Now we have phobia, the idea that it's just an irrational hatred amongst dumb people. And it's that I'm taking up. I don't doubt that the American government has done some really terrible things post 9/11, and I'm opposed to pretty much every piece of anti-terror legislation passed by the American and the British governments. But speaking from the British experience, I think we need to get a balance on this, because in Britain, absolutely, more authoritarian legislation has been passed in the name of protecting Muslims from hate speech and hatred than has been passed in the name of policing Muslims. That's from the British experience, and I want to ensure that America doesn't go down the same route. So we need to be critical of anti-terror legislation which targets one part of the population to the extent that it does, but we also need to be really ruthlessly critical of terms like Islamophobia, exaggerations of prejudice amongst people, and any passing of legislation that seeks to police or control what people think or how they speak about other people's faiths.
Okay, thanks. Now, I'm going to take a round of points and questions. You can make a point. You don't have to frame it as a question. You can tell us who you are and where you're from if you'd like to, but you don't have to. Okay, this side. We're going to go from side to side.
Thank you. My name is William McGowan. I'm an author and a journalist. I have a book coming out about the New York Times a week from tomorrow. During the time I've reported and researched on this subject, I've gotten deep into the subject of Islam in America as well as the war on terrorism. A couple of observations. Wendy Kaminer, we had 80,000 Arab men in this country who had exactly the same profile as the 9/11 hijackers. So I think some of the heavy-handedness has to be seen within the zeitgeist. They were flailing. They had no idea what to do. They had no idea what was coming next. I was down at Ground Zero at the command center that day and just saw the utter chaos and confusion. So I think you have to bear that in mind. That's an observation. Second observation, the reporter from Al Jazeera talking about limitations on free speech. Wendy Kaminer's colleague in free speech, Jeffrey Stone, and I have had communication over the years, and I've heard him speak a number of times. Jeffrey, of course, is the dome, as we used to say at Newsweek, on First Amendment issues historically. And he says that those who think that we're going through the dark night of the soul in terms of free speech here after 9/11 know nothing about what happened in the 1920s and the 1940s, vis-a-vis the Palmer raids, vis-a-vis the internment of the Japanese, et cetera. But here's something I'd like to ask. And this may seem a little heretical, particularly given the direction of the two observations I just made, but I'm wondering if the people responsible for redeveloping downtown Manhattan had something in that hole, had gotten their act together, and had put up some buildings, would Cordoba House be as big a deal? And I guess maybe I'll ask another heretical question too. At what point do we say to the 9/11 families, you can't have a veto on everything to do with Islam, with the war on terrorism, on a municipal level and on a national level? At what point do we put those brackets?
Thanks. Over here.
My name is Nancy McDermott. I actually write for Spiked, so I'm a little biased. I also live in a neighborhood in New York where it's impossible to throw a rock or maybe a book without hitting a member of the kind of liberal elite. And the thing that strikes me about this issue, and other issues as well, is the astounding ability for liberals to be able to take almost any issue and turn it into an issue that is really about some fundamental flaw in the mass of the American people. So after 9/11, and I was here for 9/11, a lot of people I know and people in the press said, why do they hate us so much? Why do they hate us so much? And they asked that question, which, for a start, is just a real misunderstanding of what 9/11 was all about, because I actually don't think it would matter if America had been incredibly sensitive to Muslims. I don't think that would have prevented the attack. But they asked this question, and I think they have come up with the answer is that no, it's not they don't like us because we're sensitive. They just don't like all those other people out there who aren't sensitive. And so you can they've taken this issue and reposed it as an issue of the problem of those mass of stupid people outside New York. And if you actually talk to people outside New York, they're not stupid, and they're actually much more ambivalent about things like the Tea Party or Sarah Palin than I think people give them credit for. But I think there is this sense that the elite are treating 9/11 as a teachable moment. We're going to teach you to be enlightened like us, and it makes people mad as hell. And I think that is partially explains why the reaction has been what it is. And I actually think that you'll probably see it become focused on other issues as well. But it's not necessarily about those issues. It's about something bigger going on in this country.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Sheikh Musa Drame. I'm the chairman of Islamic Cultural Center of North America in the Bronx. We run the only full-time Islamic school in the Bronx, which opened September 11, World Trade Center bombing, the killing of Mayor Kahan, and a lot of other things. And America was never, ever attacked Muslims in general. Only after 9/11, when the tragedy was overwhelmed, then America has every right to make sure that the terrible individuals who call themselves Muslims do not have a place in the society. I run a full-time Islamic school. Not a single time did I ever receive any bias attack or even a call because of what we do. Today, if you come to our center, we have a mosque on one side, and at the back of the mosque, I have a Jewish synagogue which pay no rent, because Quran, if you go to Quran chapter 2, verses 62, chapter 2, verses 62, God said, Muslims who follow Quran, Jews who follow Torah, Christians who follow Bible, if they believe in God and do the right deeds, they have nothing to fear. Now, when Muslims, when we talk about coming together as people of the book, a lot of my Muslim brothers and sisters said, oh, you can only deal with them fairly, but you cannot really be friends with the Jewish people and the Christian people. And Quran never, ever sanctioned that. If you go to chapter 5, verses 3 to 6 in the Quran, it talks about Muslims and Jews and Christians are people of the book. You can marry their women. You can eat their food. They can eat your food. Now, when we allow these terrorist individuals who call themselves Muslims try to define us, now we're in deep trouble. America is the best place for Muslims to live, work, and go to school. There's no other place in the world, including the Muslim countries, that can compete with America. No other country will tolerate Muslims as America does. So we, as Muslims, must now come forward and be truthful to the value that America has and stop blaming everything else for our failure. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to take the lady there, then I'm going to get to the panel, and then I'm going to come back out again. Yes.
Hi, my name is Elaine Terrace. Wendy, I have a question, and then I'll go on with something else. Are you opposed to hate speech legislation? Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, in general. Yes, to the extent, maybe you could pose a piece of legislation to me that I think would pass constitutional muster, but as a general principle, yes, I'm opposed to prohibiting speech that is considered by some people hateful.
What if that speech were so hateful that it elicited, like crying fire in a movie?
Well,
house?
That's not, it is, it has for a long time been constitutionally... It has for a long time been constitutionally permissible to regulate speech that intends to immediately incite violence and is likely to succeed. That's essentially what the standard is. Now, that's not hate speech. That's incitement to violence, but it's a pretty narrow standard, and it has to be immediate. In other words, if Kristen is in some way under my control, and I say to her, go beat that person up, I don't have a First Amendment right to say that. I mean, that language is practically subsumed in an assault. It's almost like an attempted assault. But that's a very narrow standard. If I say to her, I think all women are despicable, or all Jews are despicable, if I attack her on racial or ethnic grounds, or I attack her sex, make some horribly bigoted remark, if I hurl an epithet at her, I think I have a right to do that. Doesn't make me a good person, but I think I have a right to do that.
Thank you. Just one other thing. A couple of years ago, Elie Wiesel spoke at the 92nd Street Y, and his subject was tolerance. Now, words take on different meaning with time. And tolerance used to be a perfectly acceptable word. Mm-hmm. But I think Mr. Wiesel has a point when he goes on to describe the difference between tolerance, respect, and civility. And he said, tolerance is not always possible. And he said, respect is not always possible, but it's the next step. If you can't do tolerance, you might be able to respect. And he went on to the third, which was civility. And I'd like to give you, which you can always be. You don't have to get into fisticuffs, so you're civil. I'd like to give an example of something happened to me immediately after, very shortly after having heard him. I'm going to skip the entirety of the story and just give you the end. Although I'd love to do the whole thing. All right. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's after the closed circuit TV debate between an evangelical preacher whose name escapes me and Michael Newdow, and on the subject of under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, and I attended this thing, and then afterwards I was invited out with some people from the church where I went to hear it, because this young lady who was in her 30s had never met an atheist. And we had gotten to talking at the church, and she invited me to dinner, and she said, I'd like to learn something about this. Now, I'm not entirely stupid, so when we sat down at dinner, and we were with her sister and a male friend, and when we sat down, I had made up my mind very clearly for myself that I would not initiate anything. I would only answer questions as asked. So we go through this whole thing where I had answers fine, where I didn't, I suggested books to read. Okay, so at the very end, I say goodbye to her, I say goodbye to her sister, and this young man who had said not one word at the table, said to me, I need for you to know that I resent the fact that you sat here all evening proselytizing. And I said, do you know the meaning of proselytizing? Evidently not. And he said, I said, I made it a very big point only to answer questions as given. And he said, well, my religion tells me that that I must tell you that if you do not take Christ into your heart, you will burn in hell. And I immediately thought of Elie Wiesel, where tolerance was simply not in the cards, where respect also didn't meet the standards. And so I just turned around and walked away, which was the civil thing to do. I just wanted to share that with
Okay,
you.
thank you. So there's a number of issues that have come up. I'm going to come back to you guys. So there's a number of issues that have come up. Feel free to take up any of them. I mean, just a reminder, a couple of them. Is it, has the 9/11 families has it been enough now? Is it time to move on? Should they still have such a big voice in terms of being able to challenge things? Was 9/11 a teachable moment in terms of kind of how people should respond to things, a kind of etiquette of behaviour? And people often start saying things sometimes like, or as a Muslim or as a Jew. I'm wondering what people think, this is my question, but what it actually means to be a Muslim and what it means to be an American, because I always thought a Muslim could be a Republican and a Democrat, could be middle class, could be working class, could be anything, could be all sorts of things. I didn't think it was a homogenous group as such. And what that means in relationship to being an American. But any of those points, and who would like to go first? Yes, Zead.
Regarding the first heretical question, which is if the buildings had been rebuilt very quickly, would the Park 51 issue be there? I don't think so. The reason why is the real estate value would have been so that Sharif El-Gamal would not have been able to afford it. I know, no, it's the truth. I know him, and I know him well. We have dinner together sometimes, and I talk to him about it. Huh? Well, no, he's got to. He doesn't have the $100 million to build the building. He's got to go out and raise it. I mean, he basically has walked through the gamut for the past couple of years, walked over the coals, so to speak, got his permits. So he's clear on all legal grounds to tear down the building that's there and put shovel into ground and get going. But he's got to get the money to do it.
Okay, we can.
Injured pride.
Okay, we've took your points before. We can come back for a second round for you, but if you go and carry on.
But that's my impression, that if this had happened years back, I just don't think he would have been financially capable of building that building. I wanted to address just real quickly the imam of the Bronx, because that was a really interesting comment that he had. I think that Muslims are very hard on themselves. I'll tell you the truth, but so is everybody else. We're no different, right? When he says Muslims think that 9/11 wasn't caused by Muslims, I know many Americans who don't believe it either. And there's conspiracy theorists. I mean, a great percentage of Americans don't think Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone either. I mean, we believe in conspiracy theories sometimes.
Well,
and
we
that's
also
just,
saw Jack Ruby shoot him on television.
That's right. And so I don't think it's necessarily fair to say. I mean, whatever is good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we can't always think that, if we can't always assume, let's step into other people's shoes and see how they see this thing, then I think it's an issue. But one thing I do agree with him on, and he made a very good statement, is that the U.S. is the best place for Muslims to thrive. Thrive meaning practice their religion fairly. There was a small conversation that we had recently, and we made the argument that it is the best place. You know why? Because even in Islamic nations, and look at all the Islamic nations around the world, many of them are run by despots who are not acting in the best interest of Islam. They're not acting in Islamic ways, and they deprive people of their ability to think freely, as Muslims are supposed to be able to do. Seek knowledge from the womb to the grave, we're taught. Read, read, read were the first words to Muhammad. So Muslims, and there's a theory that the decline of the Islamic empire is based on the fact that schools of thought became solidified, and you did not have the opportunity to think freely. And the rise of the Islamic empire came on the fact that the sciences were all valued. And
thanks, Brendan.
I just want to quickly defend American people's right to not know anything about Islam, because I don't think they have to. Why should they have to? And this is an example, I think, of where tolerance is now being confused with recognition, and they are really different things. And I think lots of, not Muslims themselves, but certainly Muslim groups that claim to represent Muslim people, are really demanding recognition of their faith, recognition of their suffering. That's a therapeutic category. They want state and public recognition of their right to exist, of how wonderful they are, of how brilliant they are, and everything else. And I think that's partly where the Islamophobia industry comes from. And in Europe, there is definitely an Islamophobia industry. Muslim groups go trawling for evidence of crimes and hate speech and abuse of Muslims. They literally go trawling for it. You can't go to a public toilet in Britain without seeing a poster saying, "Are you a Muslim? Have you been abused? Please phone us." I mean, they're begging you to tell them that you have been abused, because in our era of victimhood, groups gain moral authority by proving with facts and evidence and lists and numbers that they are an oppressed minority. So it's a really dangerous game. This confusion of tolerance and recognition, this promotion of recognize my victimhood, is a really dangerous game, I think. And it actually creates further distance between communities rather than doing anything to rectify it. And just secondly, quickly, listening to Wendy's typically brilliant defense of freedom of speech, it really got me wondering, because I'm a great admirer of the First Amendment and of America's history with free speech. But I wonder if libertarians rely too heavily on the First Amendment as a kind of, almost like waving this kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. You know, here's the First Amendment, therefore this must be allowed, therefore that can't be allowed. And it really came to mind when you think to something like the gay marriage controversy, where people in California vote against gay marriage, but then lots of gay rights activists rely heavily on legislation and law and legalism in order to overturn that. And I wonder if there is a danger in relation to some of these discussions where American people feel alienated from the First Amendment because it's used to say, right, we're going to override what you want because the First Amendment is more important. And does that create a sense of distance between the American public and the First Amendment, which protects their rights? So it's just a confusion I've always had. Partly I greatly admire the First Amendment, but partly I worry that it's used to avoid having out the public debate. And as Mill says, and I know Wendy knows this very well, the only way to prove the truth of something is to test it and argue over it and to really get to grips with it in as public a debate as possible.
Well, let me just say that I'm not going to answer Brendan, because to answer him, we'd have to have a whole other panel. And it would take about an hour, and I can maybe try to answer him privately. So let me just say that the First Amendment becomes a kind of surrogate for that very debate that you're talking about. It stands for, we want it to stand for our principles of free speech. Now, 10 different people will have 10 different ideas of what the First Amendment ought to mean, and that's why we're always fighting about it. It's important because the way our legal system works, it's what, in fact, protect your rights. And I just want to take a minute to respond to the first gentleman who said, remember, there was a lot of confusion and fear after 9/11. They were flailing around a lot, and I think you said this in reference to the people who were being swept up and summarily detained. I understand that, and maybe that kind of fear and flailing around is a kind of excuse for sweeping people up initially. It is not an excuse for keeping people in very inhumane conditions, for abusing them, keeping them for months and months, and for continuing to summarily detain people in really quite lawless ways. You also talked about us having more free speech now than we ever have historically, and certainly more than we did, say, in the 20s and the 40s. Well, that's partly because the Supreme Court didn't even start enforcing our First Amendment rights, our principles of free speech, until the 1920s. But it's worth noting that just last year the court took us back about 50 or 60 years and upheld a federal law that criminalizes political advocacy, which really does take us back to the 20s and the 50s. The case was Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. I also want to point out that a lot of repression now, and a lot of repression of free speech is invisible. I mean, there's not so much need to conduct raids on people when they can just read your email. You know, there's so much invisible surveillance now. Technology has just changed it in ways that we can only begin to comprehend. We have a lot of people who want to speak, so I'm going to leave it at that.
I would just say in response to, you were saying that in Britain the Muslim groups go trolling for hate crimes. Here in the United States, Muslim groups, no offense, have been very poorly organized historically and politically especially. They have had very little voice. And that is why they are still now suffering with these rights issues, I think, that are out there. And the only way for them to address that is to get organized. I mean, maybe they don't need to go trolling for hate crimes, but it does help make the point that they're being discriminated against in some way.
Send them here, we need help.
Right. So anyway.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go out. Here we go. Yes.
Okay. My name is Jim Morris. I really like to thank the panel. It's been a lively discussion. What I want to do is call attention to the title of this evening's lecture, and it frames things regarding a culture war. I sort of want to rub that up against a term that's been thrown around, which is teaching moment. And one thing I think that occurred in the United States immediately following 9/11 is that there was about a 2 or 3 week period where you could have addressed the American public and you could have said anything, you could have asked anything of them, and they would have complied. The guy who was around a few years ago, he said, everybody go out and shop. You know, that just doesn't quite cut it for me. But what I think religion does is it teaches the next generation how to respond to real life. The guy who was around before, when he was reelected, one of the first things he did, and I remember this being published in the Times, and maybe other people remember this also, but he published a full indictment of the Muslim religion. And, you know, I'd sort of like to frame this in a context of before and after not only 9/11, but before and after the subprime mortgage crisis. There's a saying regarding fashion, you can wear whatever you want, honey, but don't scare the horses. Maybe somebody knows that expression. But my attitude is this: what will scare the horses a few years ago, it's very different than what will scare the horses right now. So if you have someone who sells a doctrine, the same guy, and it's basically a manifesto, and it's based on things like shock and awe, and we can trace shock and awe back to pre-World War II, and if you even go to that source, you can trace it to the dreaded H word, a person who was a dictator. He raised Germany to its power, so on and so forth. But the situation is this. Islamofascism, if Bush was trying to raise that as a demon when he was elected to his second term, it was not a teaching moment. No one responded. And, you know, the point I want to raise is that there's a lot more fear now, and I think that's also addressed with the conspicuous consumption of someone who would try to raise a $100 million building. So all I'm trying to do is to, you know, frame it in the context that I think someone, you know, this guy who had his doctrine tried to run it up the flagpole before, and nobody bit. Nobody really cared. But the context is different, and I was wondering if the panel could address the change in context.
Sure. Yeah.
Alex Standish. I teach at a university, state university in Connecticut. I think it's actually perhaps a testament to people's rationality and common sense that the war on terror hasn't led to any sort of widespread Islamophobia, because obviously there is a lot of rhetoric and a lot of stories in the news, and my experience of working with young people is that that they don't really buy into that, and maybe that's because they're not watching the news, which is entirely likely, but also that the young people draw upon their own experience, their own experiences of meeting people. I don't think that they need to have courses and have studied Islam, but I think that young people have grown up in a system where they meet people from all over the world, from different faiths, from different religions and so forth, and if there's one thing that young people I think are very adamant about is that people should be treated equally regardless of where they come from and what they believe and so forth. So I don't think it's the case that young people are in particular buying into the stories that are on the news and are fearful of Muslims.
Thank you. We've got Jean Smith, the other director of the New York Salon.
Well, I wanted to address this point that Brendan O'Neill made about the elite fear of the ignorant masses, and this fear of the masses being out of control. And obviously, nobody says in public, that they think the masses are stupid. People say it in different ways, and so. One of the things that you said, Zead, was that, which I think is another way of expressing the same point of view, was that, well, people just need to get to know more Muslims, and then, people would realize that, Muslims are great people. And I'm sure you're a great guy. I'm sure you have great table manners. But I'm sure there are also lots of Muslims who are not great guys. And, this idea that people just need to know more Muslims, I think, we have to look a little bit deeper than that, because it still begs the question of why in the US, at a certain level, there is this really strong sense of atomization and vulnerability and fear. And I think it's interesting when Michael Bloomberg takes time off from telling us what we can not eat and what we cannot drink, aside from trying to tell us where we can, not smoke. I think that he's actually, gotten himself a lot of credibility through the whole, the whole discussion about building the Islamic Center around Ground Zero. And I think that, what liberals have been able to do is to kind of get some credibility by distancing themselves from those people over there who are so intolerant. But I think that it still does beg the question why the liberals are afraid as well, and why the liberals are afraid of the masses and are afraid of the people being slightly out of control and liable to become a anti-Muslim rabble at any point. And it seems that the thing that's missing is any kind of positive looking forward from, and I think this was very clear in the recent elections. So we're all looking back, and not to take anything away from people who lost people on 9/11 when their friends and families were murdered. But at the end of the day, we're all the while looking back instead of looking forward, and it seems that it's hard to know where is that going to come from. Where is that positive vision for the future that can inspire and cohere and take people forward, as Americans and as a total country. Where is that going to come from? And I think the person that raised the question about the building, at actual Ground Zero makes a very valid point, because, if Mayor Bloomberg wanted to really give a lead, they'd make that project happen. They'd build it bigger and better than it was before. So it was a real, kind of challenge to, people who try to make New Yorkers afraid. And the mayor would put himself on the top floor. He'd have his office on the top floor. And I think that's, and it's not to say that people should be, kind of bravado and tough just for the sake of it. But I think that, that kind of, it's like fear begets fear. And it's almost like, we say there's going to be a problem and it creates a problem. But the difficulty that I have is just trying to, work out where is that vision going to come from that can really drive us forward, as Americans and as New Yorkers? And it seems that it's hard to see where it would come from.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to be slightly quicker now, faster. Okay, yes.
Sure. Well, here's another New Yorker with an English accent, just to show that the English are taking over this issue, the new school or something. Actually, it is a quick question, and that is, we've talked about the opposition to the mosque, which isn't really a mosque; it's a center with all sorts of things and a prayer room, as being sort of insensitive because of the insensitivity of it. But both in your own opinion, but also in any research that you've done, and I'm as interested in the research as your opinion. To what extent do you think in the opposition to the mosque there is a sense of sort of triumphalism of, they destroyed the buildings and now they're building a mosque on top of the side, sort of a bit like Hagia Sophia converted to a mosque in Istanbul as well. I'm interested in that, and I'm actually surprised that it hasn't come up as one of the things that maybe people feel when they oppose the mosque. So I'd love you to address that.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you.
Okay. Actually, Newt Gingrich said that. He said that the reason they want to build it there is because every time the Muslims take over somewhere, they do something, they put up a trophy mosque. So Newt Gingrich did say that. My name is Melvin Reveron. I'm one of those anonymous bloggers that only 2 or 3 people reads. I'm a Muslim convert. I've been a Muslim for 6 years. And when you talk about Islamophobia, phobia is still phobia. And when some people found out that I was a Muslim, I did get a little bit of a backlash. Some people didn't want to talk, and this was before what happened over the summer. But the point I wanted to talk about is about the First Amendment, because we were talking about sensitivity. And one of the articles that I posted that nobody ever read was called The Prophet and the Flag. It was about the Prophet Muhammad and the South Park cartoon earlier this year. And I'm a free speech absolutist. So I'm not one of those that's, everybody has the right to free speech. But the point I wanted to make in my article was that speech has to persuade. And if I wanted to protest the American involvement in Iraq or Afghanistan, burning an American flag would not exactly do what I wanted to do. It would turn people off and people would tune me out completely. So that was one of the points that I wanted to make in my article. So when we talk about sensitivity, maybe it's not the word, but I guess what one of my professors once said about, I have a right to say whatever I want. I could say the earth is flat. The government would never do anything to stop me from saying that, because people are going to laugh at me. But if I try to say something that the government would think of as a threat, and they try to stop me, then they're violating my right, as my First Amendment right to publish, write, or speak. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not so much sensitivity, is that if I have a right to speak, I should have an intellectual right to what I'm saying. And if I'm burning things, and if I'm just trying to cause a scene, then I'm not really speaking, I'm just venting. I'm not arguing. So that's the point that I was trying to make in my article, is that I have a right to argue a point, and I have to back it up, which is what's not going on with the debate now. Most of the things that Rick Lazio said over the summertime were completely not true. And one of the things about the media that really infuriates me is that there is no stop, you're lying, you're not telling the truth. This past week, we heard Michelle Bachmann started it on Fox, that President Obama was going to spend $200 million a day in India, 10% of the Navy was going to be protecting him, 870 rooms in the Taj Mahal were going to be rented when there's only 500. But yet, nobody said, Michelle Bachmann, you are completely wrong. So when the media, we talk about free speech, but the media is not handling its part of the free speech debate either.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I wonder what the panel thinks about the imam who's founded behind the Park 51 complex. Do you think that he and his supporters chose that site because it was near Ground Zero? Do you think that it was a deliberate, provocative move? Do you think that it was not just purely religion, at least some element of some sort of politics to what he's doing. Those are all points raised by the critics of Park 51, the likes of Sarah Palin, Newt Gingrich, and others. I don't agree with them as far as their politics. I think they raised pretty valid questions about it, which I think a lot of the liberal opposition didn't really address. I think the complex has the right to exist without them necessarily having to pass all these other tests. And I think that's been one of the things that's been dodged. I think there's a lot of things that have been dodged in those that seek to defend it. And in fact, I think that it really was problematic when, let's say, the New York Times called the complex a monument to tolerance, because it really crossed the line into advocacy, into sort of saying this is inherently good, we should support it because of what's there. That opens the door to start examining, well, what really is going on in that place? Instead of to the point about, what is the right here?
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. Well, I was just going to say one very quick thing and just open it up to you guys. We're kind of talking about two topics here that I think are actually intrinsically very distinct, but they've been brought together in a particular way for one very reason, and that is the nature of our contemporary media. On the one hand, we have the Park 51 project and whether it should exist as a building development, and then we have this whole other issue of religious tolerance, culture wars, what this building represents. And the reason why so much of the process of the conception of this idea, securing the rights to build on this space, so on and so forth, went under the radar for so long is because it's such a benign maneuver. I mean, how many times does someone apply to build a particular building on a particular site? The only reason it became what it became and was seized upon by politicians and politicized was arguably the nature of today's digital media. Its tendency to promote echo chambers, 24/7-hour news cycles, in which only the most extreme opinions tend to get the most attention. People who otherwise don't have the time to become infinitely knowledgeable about every subject in society have to cling to what they hear most. And in other words, would this panel, in essence, even be happening if it were not for the unique nature of contemporary media and its tendency to allow people of extreme viewpoints to make arguments that get attention in a way they might not have gotten originally?
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to take the panel now just to come back on these points and then to roll it into your summary so you can address some of these points when you come in. Just to remind ourselves, a couple of the key ones, whether those people out there, the mob, the fear of that, what that really means. I mean, one of the things that did strike me when I first came here, which was just at the time of 9/11, was how many people in New York, when I used to have dinner discussions with them and everything, would get very, very passionate. And they'd start saying, well, the problem is, all those people in the Midwest and the South, they just don't get it. And then they'd show me maps of former slave-owning areas. And they see, it's the same. If only they were like us on the East and the West Coast, a bit more smart. And in Britain, there were similar discussions. Those stupid people in the North who used to vote for Margaret Thatcher or other people, and they would often be blamed. And it did strike me that there was a little bit of an abdication of responsibility to win people over to arguments, and perhaps it seemed to be bucked a little bit, that trend, with the Obama phenomenon. But perhaps we've seen a little bit of that in the midterm elections as well, and certainly in terms of some of the coverage. So I'm interested to hear what people think about that ongoing discussion about people across America. And then this side, particularly interesting, is whether it was a deliberately provocative move. But any of the points that you'd like to come. Now, the order we're going to go in is in reverse order. So I'm going to ask Brendan to start.
Thanks. I must say I'm very intrigued by people's attitudes to Fox News. Everyone I meet in America is obsessed with Fox News, and I can't really understand why. And also, looking at this from Britain, it's almost as if you could be forgiven for believing that Fox News is the source of every problem in America. That's the way it's often presented, and I don't really believe that's true. I'm also worried about this continual problematization of extreme viewpoints. We've heard that quite a bit in the discussion on the floor. You know, why are these extreme viewpoints not being kept in check? Why aren't they being challenged? Why are they being allowed? Is effectively what some people are saying. But some of this is not really extremism. And even if it is, what's wrong with having an extreme viewpoint? I'm a bit of an extremist, and I'm worried about the demonization of extremism as well. And I think the key problem today, I think the key issue in the Western world is the disconnect between the liberal elite and the masses. I think that is really the key problem that we have today, and it's given rise to all sorts of problems and all sorts of new forms of illiberal authoritarian politics. And this is not just in America. It's very similar things are happening in Britain, in Australia, in European countries like Sweden and France. There is this real gaping hole between liberal elite, people who would previously have considered themselves left-wing, having a liberal outlook, believing in freedom, and the disconnection between them and the public. And it's given rise to all sorts of weird things. So I've been struck while I've been in New York, my favorite city in the world. The front cover of New York magazine this week is about the only people who can possibly understand why Americans vote the way they vote is child psychologists. We have to ask the child psychologists to analyze why Americans are voting the way they vote. In yesterday's New York Times, there was a feature on the health commissioner of New York, I can't remember his name, some doofus, who says we need to change the architecture of New York to make bad choices more difficult. So to make it more difficult for people to choose to smoke, to choose to eat fatty food. Basically, he wants to introduce the tyranny of the politics of nudge into New York, to turn New York into a nudgeocracy. And then you have Bloomberg and others saying that New Yorkers who oppose Park 51 are un-American. You know, that McCarthyite phrase to brand a certain section of the public. And that elite contempt, I think, that liberal elite contempt that is rising expressed against the public is a really problematic thing today. And it comes through very clearly in the discussion about the Ground Zero Mosque, where you have this idea of an enlightened few who understand why this mosque is so wonderful and why it should be allowed to be built, and then the ignorant mass who just don't understand Islam, don't understand why the mosque is great, and so on and so forth. And I think that's the key thing that needs to be challenged in this discussion, but in politics more broadly. The idea that there is this superior race of liberals who know better than the rest of us, kind of mongrel race of Fox News watchers or Daily Mail readers or whatever insulting terms they use to describe us.
Thanks, Brendan. Kristen.
In response to the person who asked about the imam and whether or not he specifically chose that location, remember he's been having a congregation in that neighborhood for 12 years. So I think, yeah, right in the very same neighborhood. So I think he wanted to stay in that neighborhood to serve the population down there. There's an incredible, I've read recently the number of Muslims just in that area, and I can't remember it. I'm terrible at remembering numbers, but and that building was there, and the developer bought it, so there was an opportunity. I think the fact that it's near Ground Zero, he did see as a bonus, and because of the kind of work that he has done with our government in the past as a bridge builder and the writing that he has done, I think he was not unaware of the symbolic value of it. As far as this division in America between the elites and the dirty masses, yeah, it's definitely an issue, and the media does have a role to play there. I think part of the problem, you have the blogosphere where you have these extreme views, and then you have the mainstream media, which is looking for somebody who can give them a good soundbite, who can get people riled up, who can, get viewers, get their attention. And so you have a media that talks to pundits, not necessarily the people who are directly involved. And I think whenever you go and you talk to people on the ground in Middle America, in Muslim communities in Flushing and Jackson Heights or wherever they are, people are usually much more reasonable and much more closer to being able to agree or at least get along civilly than when you listen or when you have the pundits kind of defining who we are and where we are. And so I think the media's job and what I at least attempt to do is to really talk to the people who are affected. They're harder to get to. they're not as sexy. They don't initially draw viewers like a big name person does. But if you really care about an issue and what it means, I think the media's job is to talk to the people who are really affected by an issue.
Thank you. Wendy.
Well, as a member of the liberal elite, I think that I should stand up for my class. I think it's my turn to claim a little victimhood here.
And it's okay.
First, to Brendan, I think one of the reasons why some of us seem so obsessed with Fox News is that it really has exerted an extraordinary influence over the political scene. And it's not what's problematic, I think, so much is not so much the influence that it may or may not exert on the people who watch it, but its relationship with the Republican Party. You know, and a lot of people have said that the Republican Party is actually sort of like an arm of Fox News now instead of the other way around. Now, whichever way you look at it, there's this very close relationship between Fox and the Republican Party, and it really has, in a way that the Tea Party has, Fox News, which also really helped nurture the Tea Party movement, has been radicalizing the Republican Party in ways that some of us think are not necessarily good things. I think there's also a lot of danger to this anti-elitism because it promotes this idea that we ought to elect people to high office who are just like us. Well, you know, I have to say that even as a member of the liberal elite, I don't want anybody in high office who's just like me because I know what a mess I would make of it. You know, I don't know why you want to elect ordinary people to perform extraordinary jobs. I think we need highly intelligent, highly educated people in jobs of extraordinary responsibility. I don't think that intelligence is sufficient. I think intelligence, though, is necessary. So you know, there's it's tempting in some ways to condemn the elite and to romanticize the public or the masses, though the elite, you know, are also members of the public and parts of the masses. But I think it's really important also to remember the dangers of this kind of anti-elitism.
Thank you. Zead.
I think to say elite contempt is problematic is actually contradictory just as much as to say you need to, you know, people need to know more about Muslims is. We live in a nation of with freedoms of speech, so you can't say on one hand you have the freedoms of speech, but then criticize people for criticizing other people. If you have freedoms, then they're expansive, and I think that. To be critical of any position that anybody takes. Me personally, I guess you might call me ultra-liberal. I don't care what anybody says. I don't care if you burn Korans, if you purchased it with your own money. If you walked into a mosque and burnt a Koran, that's a different story. But if you burnt your own Koran, that's your prerogative because these are the freedoms that you have. If you want to be an ultra-liberal, if you want to be an elitist, contentious elitist, if you want to be any you know, far-right group, that's your prerogative, but people have the right to critique the comments that you made and the ideas that you have, and that's fine. And none of that is bad, irrational, or illegal, in my opinion. I wanted to talk about the concept of the Victory Mosque and Imam Faisal. I had sat down with Imam Faisal personally, and I asked, who are you trying to serve here? And he said to me, he pretty much said to me, not recent immigrants. So there's a category of people that he wants to address, and that's most likely the professional Muslims of an educated upper, higher income Muslims. That's what he said. And he's on Warren Street, which is right around the block from Park Place. Literally, it's on the other side of the block on Park Place. That's where he was since the early 1970s. So he just doesn't want to leave the neighborhood. He has a following there. And believe it or not, when you go pray at Park 51 like I have on a Friday with over 600 people present, a lot of these people are wearing business suits and have name tags, which is their security clearance to get into the private buildings that are all around them at ground zero. So he's serving a community. He has been serving a community for decades. Now, the Victory Mosque issue. There's actually an argument, a debate right now in Spain, in Cordoba. The largest mosque in Cordoba in history was the Cordoba. They call it the mesquite, the cathedral, the mesquite. Now, when the Spaniards took it over in 1492, the largest and one of the most beautiful mosques, actually it's considered the most beautiful mosque ever built in Spain during the Moorish expansion there, was turned into horse stables, and then eventually into a cathedral, which was hunky-dory. I mean, all the Muslims think about in history is that it was conquered, and it's just a pity because it was such a beautiful, beautiful structure. They understand the concept. So somebody who's trying to compare the Hagia Sophia to the Park 51, that wasn't picked as a victory mosque. Sharif Jemal told me that he met Imam Faisal, was enamored with his sermons, and said, you know what, you deserve better than this first floor basement, or, first floor or basement structure that you're in. It's too small, you have too large of a following. I really want to purchase something and in the community, and bam, that was there. He did not look around for something as close as he can get to the building. And these are personal conversations that I've had with them, and I believe them and I trust them. And that's how that site got there. It was just luck of the draw. The price was right. That building is probably appraised at 3 times at the price that he got it, when he got it. So it was a home run, a real estate deal as far as that was concerned. And it's serving the community that's there. I wanted to talk just quickly about Fox really in a second. There was an article in the New York Times where Rupert Murdoch said, you know what, look, this whole Obama thing, I mean, look, we're crucifying the guy on a daily basis. Everybody loves him. Why don't we just, and I don't mind him either, why don't we just start saying nice things about him? And his chief of staff said, if you do, I'm leaving. I made you $880 million last year. You know why? Because 50% of the country doesn't like him, and that's who we're serving. And we're about the only game in town, buddy. But there's about 20 other stations who like him, and they're divvying up that profit. So when you look at it as a business plan, it's really profitable to say negative things about, and that's why Fox is considered the monster on that side of the story.
Thank you. Firstly, can we thank our panel this evening? As always, these discussions will run on, and often we can only open up the discussion a little bit and tease some of these questions out, but often they throw up more questions than answer them. We would like to invite you to stay and have a drink with us after, and also to come along on the 17th to our next salon, which is America Still an Immigrant Nation, where we've also got a fantastic panel there. Just one thing on people. I mean, one thing at the New York Salon, we are committed to free speech and free debate, but we do think that people are not stupid and dumb, but they have shaped and made history in the world. But often people only do that, whether they're educated or not, when they understand the issues and are engaged in them. And we think that's the big problem today, that a lot of the time the public and the public sphere are quite cynical about politics and politicians and about ideas, and that is our aspiration. So we'd love to hear from you guys, and stay in touch. And thank you very much to the New School and to Fora TV and the Battle of Ideas. Thank you.